Hi, thank you so much for joining me. I'm Erin Owens. I'm a professor in the Newton Gresham Library at SHSU. Today I'm going to be talking about publishing in the open, why, when, and how. A few of my objectives for this session: to define what open access publishing is and how it differs from traditional publishing, to list some reasons why open access is important and sometimes required, to understand the various models of open access publishing, and to apply a decision tree to recognize when it may be appropriate or not to pay a fee for open access publication. So let's get started. Why open access? This is our first question. And let's start with a definition of what we even mean by open access. Spark defines open access as the free, immediate online availability of research articles, combined with the rights to use these articles fully in the digital environment. UNESCO similarly defines OA as free access to information and unrestricted use of electronic resources for everyone. Our definition from the Open Society Foundation says open access is a publishing and distribution model that makes scholarly research literature, much of which is funded by taxpayers around the world, freely available to the public online without restrictions. So I want to highlight the key elements shared by these definitions: free to read with limited restrictions on reuse. Now, I realize the Spark definition specifies research articles. It is worth noting that the open access publishing landscape goes far beyond just journal articles at this point. There are indeed open access monographs published, but focusing on articles as one of the places where open access publishing is most urgent and has seen the most growth is valuable. So why OA? Sometimes we may publish in open access by reasons of requirement. Many funders are beginning to require that the findings from the research they fund be made open. This is increasingly common among federal funders in particular. So if you receive research grant funds from organizations like the NIH, the NEH, the USDA, etc., you may see already or very soon begin to see requirements for open access publication of the findings that come out of those grants. This is because, again, taxpayer dollars are funding those grants, and therefore taxpayers deserve access to the research they've paid for. This graphic helps to summarize some of the impact possible from open access publishing of research. It can help researchers and their institutions to build their reputations, demonstrate their achievements, build their networks and their connections, and continue to create more impact and more research. It can also help readers themselves to advance their knowledge, affect public policy, community, update practitioners in their fields, and so forth. So there's a lot of potential benefit among different stakeholder groups to think about with OA. Now, sometimes we may not be required to publish open access, but we may still wish to do so for reasons of equity. Not all institutions have the same resources available. Some universities can afford far more journal subscriptions than others, for example. Additionally, not all researchers have institutional affiliations. A researcher not connected to a university who can afford very expensive journal subscriptions will find themselves at a loss for accessing the research that is most critical to underpinning their new research. Additionally, not all application of research findings originates from other researchers, right? So while we may be up in an ivory tower speaking to other academics in an ivory tower, there may be other practitioners, boots on the ground, who need to apply what we're learning when we do our research in the ivory towers of academia. Think about PK through 12 teachers in the public school classrooms. Think about nurses in hospitals, or practicing dietitians, physical trainers, counselors, and numerous other fields. They can make real-world application of your research that they have to be able to access it, and most of them aren't going to have expensive journal subscriptions through a university. Ultimately, inaccessible research publications can't benefit anyone. They can't benefit practice, policy, or community. Even other researchers who are working at well-resourced institutions can ultimately benefit from getting your findings faster and with fewer restrictions to continue building knowledge in your discipline and beyond. A few data points here for illustration. This figure shows the dollar price tags that a variety of universities pay for their subscriptions with a single publisher. Keep that in mind, single publisher. So for example, the University of Michigan pays well over $2 million just for the journal subscriptions from Elsevier. And that's not including journals published by any other publisher or scholarly society. Now, I want you to take two things away from this visual. One, the sheer size of these dollar amounts. Journal publications are expensive to subscribe to at an institutional level. The other thing I want you to take away from it, though, is the variability, comparing what different institutions pay to even the same publishers. There is a lot of variation in what a publisher can charge based on size of an institution, the number of researchers, and the budget that that institution may have in play. If we look at this data from another perspective, this table shows what each of these three journals cost for a subscription in 1983, what they would cost now if we based it on true inflation, and the actual cost today, or as of 2020 when this table was put together. We can see that the journal Science cost $85 in 1983. While we might expect a subscription to have increased to $136 based on inflation, in reality, it costs more than $25,000 in the University of Missouri's system in particular. This should really drive home how much these prices have gone up and how difficult it becomes for any one institution to fund all of the possible journals their researchers might need. In the US, taxpayers spend about $140 billion every year supporting research that they cannot then easily access themselves. Meanwhile, in 2010, Elsevier's scientific publishing arm reported a 36% profit margin, which was higher than Apple, Google, or Amazon posted that same year. In 2016, an article in Science described how a PhD candidate in Iran would have had to spend $1,000 a week just to read the papers that he needed for his studies. That's not going to be tenable for most graduate students. And finally, this quote from 2019, a librarian and economics professor tells us that the price of scientific journals now are so high that not a single university in the US, not the University of California, not Harvard, no institution can afford to subscribe to them all. It's really true. Even Harvard, with its massive endowments, said in 2012 that its $3.5 million a year subscriptions bill was untenable. It's simply not something that can be sustained in the long run, particularly when we take into account the rate of inflation that these publishers add year over year on top of these already outrageous prices. So as we look at all of this economics of publishing data, I want to ask you to ponder a question. How much did you earn from the last journal article that you published? Take a minute, try to remember. I can tell you, I don't remember earning a single dollar on any of the journal articles that I've published with scholarly journal publishers such as Elsevier, Wiley, Taylor and Francis, etc. They're earning a lot of profit. It's not trickling down to the authors, and the benefits of those publications are not necessarily trickling down to the taxpayers who pay for grant-funded research. So we've talked a little now about the why. Let's move on to the how. What are some routes to open access publishing? I want to start by actually looking at the path of traditional journal publishing. So if we think about a traditional scholarly journal as it would have been published 100 years ago, the author provides the content. The publisher then distributes that content via a subscription journal. Those subscription fees are paid by a university, some other sort of institution, occasionally by simply an individual researcher who subscribes on their own. Users who have access to a paid subscription read the content that's been published. And then if users wish to reuse that content again to build on it in future research, they pay permission fees for that content reuse. As we look at this flow, our takeaway should be that a user without institutional affiliation, with fewer institutional resources, or without substantial personal capital would basically have no access to read or reuse the vast majority of research findings. Now let's take a look at an alternate flow for open access publishing. The author still provides the content. The publisher still distributes the content, possibly by various means, which we'll dive into in a moment. All users then, at the end of that distribution, can freely read the content. No payment on their part, no institutional affiliation required. And when other researchers choose to build on that published content with new findings and new research, they face few limitations to reusing that content. Looking at this flow, our takeaway is that everyone has access, regardless of their affiliations or funding, and the findings then have more opportunity to be applied and create change. But as I said, there's a lot of variation in what can happen with that distribution stage. How is that content distributed? So let's dive into that in a little more detail. The author provides the content to the publisher, and then we can see one of several paths. The publisher may distribute the article openly with no fee charged to anyone. They simply post the file on their official journal website. It is available for everyone immediately. In other cases, the publisher may distribute the article openly with a fee paid by the author or their institution, grant funder, etc. In this pathway, even though the final product is free for readers, there is still a cost involved to offset the publishing costs, but that cost is now taken on by the author and can be incorporated into their grant funding mechanisms if they have them. The third possible route is that the publisher does the same thing it's always traditionally done. It distributes the article in a subscription journal that can only be accessed by users with paid subscriptions. But at the same time, the publisher allows the author to make a version of the article openly and freely available according to the publisher's specific policies. This is sort of a spectrum of publishing models that we can think of. We have our traditional model. Nothing comes openly from the publisher, and all content is available only through paid subscriptions. We see hybrid models. Some of the articles are openly available directly from the publisher, generally based on fees paid by the author. But then other content is only available to paid subscribers. In the green model, this is where the burden falls on the author to share the article. The publisher puts it through a subscription journal, but they give the author certain permissions to share a version of the article freely. Note that that's not always the final, formal, polished PDF of the article. In many cases, it's the accepted version, which is essentially the last Word document you send to your publisher after all of your revisions are complete and the article is accepted. Moving on from the green model, we have the gold model. In this model, nothing comes from the publisher through a subscription. Everything is open on the publisher's official website, but there is a fee absorbed by the author or their institution. And then finally, diamond, or what is also called platinum open access publishing. All articles are shared openly and freely by the publisher. There are no fees transferred to the author. So this is a genuinely free model on both sides. Free for the author to make it open, free for the reader to read it once it is open. Now, it's worth noting that this terminology, green, gold, diamond, was chosen by those who advocate for open access to research. So terms like gold and diamond do suggest a bias in favor of open. They make open sound shinier, prettier, more valuable. I want to make the caveat that this does not necessarily mean traditional journals are bad, right? We don't mean for that terminology to cast them into a negative light. It also doesn't mean that all open journals are automatically better than traditional journals. We can have low quality and high quality journals at both ends of the spectrum. These are simply different ends of a spectrum, different models for trying to make the economics of publishing work. And individual researchers' priorities and values, as well as simply what resources they have access to, will factor into their choice of where they publish in this spectrum for every individual article that they publish. So let's talk about these fees that publishers sometimes offload to authors. When is it worth it to pay for open access publishing? Now, I want to start by addressing the elephant in the room, because it can sound scandalous to talk about paying to publish. And it's not uncommon to confuse open access publishing fees on the one hand with vanity publishing or predatory publishing fees on the other hand. So let's be very, very sure that we're clear on what we mean and what we don't mean when we talk about paying. What is not okay? It is not okay to pay for the right to submit a paper for consideration. It's not right to pay for the privilege of having your paper peer reviewed by other scholars. It's not okay to pay for the privilege of having an article published that wouldn't otherwise have been accepted on its own merits without the money. And it's not okay to pay for publication when the publisher clearly adds no value to the work. That is to say, they're not doing any substantive constructive review by the editors or by peer reviewers. They're not providing any formal copy editing, layout, formatting. They're not assigning persistent identifiers like DOIs to your article. They're not distributing their work so that your work is discoverable through indexing and abstracting services. These are the things we expect a publisher to do. This is why publishing costs money, because they're providing these services. So we don't want to pay a publisher who is clearly doing nothing except pushing our paper down an assembly line onto a website, which I could have put it on a website myself and not paid them for, right? It is okay to pay a transparent fee for an article that has already been reviewed and accepted on its own merits and to which the publisher has added or will add value and improve quality, to pay for that article to be made freely accessible, ostensibly offsetting the reader subscription fee that would pay to support the publisher's services. So when is it worth it to pay an APC or an article processing charge to make sure that your article appears in open access? The short answer is, if you have researched and determined that a journal that charges these fees is the best option for this specific paper, either to fulfill the mandate of your grant funding agency or to most effectively reach the intended audience. If you have determined that that's the best choice for that, or if your personal values as a person demand that your work be shared open, but you can find absolutely no other routes to do so than through a fee. Ultimately, I don't think many of us will find ourselves in the second camp. It can be very hard to put up our own money where that value is to pay for our articles to be published. Many researchers aren't going to have the privilege of being able to do that. But certainly in the first case, if we find that that journal really is the only or best option to achieve what we need, that's the moment when it is probably okay to pay that fee. Now that's the short answer. I put together a flowchart for you here that's a little bit of a longer, more complicated answer. Don't worry about trying to read it all right now. You can reference it in the slides that are shared with this recording. This will walk you through some questions to ask yourself about whether your grant funder requires that you publish OA, whether you have a personal preference for OA, whether your audience will have access to the article if it is behind a subscription, and then also walking you through some steps to check various resources like Sherpa Romeo, Sherpa Juliet, and the DOAJ, the Directory of Open Access Journals, to find out what options exist. If we can find an option which fulfills your requirements and does not charge you a fee, that's the way we want to go whenever possible. So we need to judge what are those options, which ones are appropriate. I hope this flowchart will help you as a tool in making that decision, but you'll also notice that several nodes of this flowchart end by recommending that you ask the scholarly communication librarian, who is me. So please always feel free to reach out for support in making these kinds of judgments and saying, hey, do I need to pay this fee or do I have another better option? Now I want to dive in a little bit more on green OA archival. We saw green OA in our spectrum of publishing methods. This is the mechanism where a publisher does not share the journal article openly, but they allow authors certain permissions to do so. Let's dive into this a little bit more. So what is green archival? Again, the publication of record occurs in a traditional subscription journal, but a version of the article is also uploaded to an open site. That might be the author's personal website, their institutional repository, or another non-commercial repository like Archive, or it might be a commercial repository like ResearchGate. Sometimes this upload can happen immediately upon publication. Sometimes it happens after an embargo period of, say, 12 months or 18 months. That all depends on the publisher's policies. In some cases, the version which is uploaded openly must link back to the published version of record. Sometimes other requirements must be. So what version of an article is it that we're posting openly when we participate in green open access archival? There are several versions that we can think of a paper existing in as it goes through a submission and publication process. The submitted manuscript or preprint, this is the version that you finish writing and send off to the publisher for consideration in their journal. It has not yet benefited from peer review or revisions, at least not for that particular submission. Next, we have the peer review revisions that are occurring, and we have our marked up manuscript where we're making changes, reorganizing, rewording, taking into account the feedback that we've gotten. That may happen through multiple cycles of peer review, but eventually we hope our paper is accepted by the journal, and then we land at our accepted manuscript or post-print. And as I said earlier, you can essentially think of this as being the last Word document that you finished making all of your revisions, making the text all clean, and sending it back to the journal to be published, to go through their copy editing and publishing process. That's where it goes into publisher versions from the author versions. The publisher will then copy edit, layout, format. They go through all of their things to make your file look the way their journal should look in the end product. Some journals will have an in-press version that occurs at this point. Sometimes it may be labeled something like online first. And essentially this is a slightly less official version of the article that they have published to their website, but they don't yet consider it to be really published. So in most cases, you'll see that the article does not yet have an issue or volume number assigned to it. It just gives subscription readers a little bit of a sneak peek, faster access to the content. Finally, we end up with our actual published version. This is the formal PDF document from the publisher that has everything laid out and designed on the page exactly the way it would look printed in a journal, even if they don't actually print them on paper anymore. So this is what we can think of as being our different versions. Publisher policies will usually discuss what you can and cannot share in terms of the preprint, the postprint, and the publisher's PDF. So those are the three key terms to be aware of: preprint or submitted, postprint or accepted, and published. Now let's take a look at how we determine what a journal's policies are in this regard. This is where we look at an amazing tool called Sherpa Romeo. You can search for a journal title to read all of their policies regarding open access archival. I'm going to show you an example here from the Journal of Academic Librarianship, a journal that I publish in my field. We see here the list of publisher policies. You'll see each row is labeled as either published version, accepted version, or submitted version. So we can go through and expand one of these rows to see in detail what their policies are for that specific version of the paper. Now, note, I'm showing you an example from one journal, but these policies, including what websites you're allowed to post on and any embargo periods, these vary widely by publishers. So don't look at this example as your guide. Always go look at Sherpa Romeo for your actual journal. So here is the expanded set of policies for the submitted version. This is our preprint, pre-revision document. This version may be shared on any website with no embargo. So I may freely share the preprint of my paper before it has benefited from revision and publication. Now here's my accepted version, or my postprint, post-revision final version of content. They tell me here that I can share it on a non-commercial institutional repository, a non-commercial website, or a subject repository after an embargo of 12 months, and I must link to the publisher version with DOI. I'm not necessarily reading every detail here to you, but I want you to get these highlights. When they tell us a non-commercial website, it is very, very important to realize ResearchGate and academia.edu, while they are both popular places to share papers, both qualify as commercial. So do be careful about these publisher policies, even if they allow you to share it somewhere like our SHSU repository or archive.org or your own personal website. Be clear that it may not permit ResearchGate or academia.edu. Now here is a different set of policies for the accepted version. There are different pathways. So that first pathway was if I was placing the file on a non-commercial institutional repository, non-commercial website, or subject repository. That has a 12-month embargo. This next pathway, though, says that if I post this file on my author homepage, my personal website, or a non-commercial website, I can do that with no embargo. So I may post it on my personal author website immediately, and then 12 months later, I would be free to share it on some other non-commercial repositories. Now, here are three different pathways that might apply for the published version of an article. And I've highlighted the currency symbol here to note that for this particular journal, any option by which you may be able to share your published version is going to entail a fee, an article processing charge. So they have no free pathways for sharing the final published version. And that will be very common. Most publishers who allow green archival will want you to focus on your submitted or accepted manuscript versions. So to recap a little bit, open access makes research findings accessible more quickly to a wider audience of users, both within and beyond research institutions, thus increasing the opportunity for those findings to impact further research, practice, policy, community, and to create change. Open access publishing can sometimes be done without cost. While it is not ethical to pay for the privilege of having an article reviewed or published, we sometimes face circumstances where paying an article processing charge for open access publication is the best choice for that paper. A quick note here about support from our SHSU library. We're here to support you through the process of open access publishing or traditional publishing, whatever you choose that's best for you and any given manuscript. We can help you to determine whether your grant funder has any mandates for open access publishing, to integrate open access publication fees into your funding application budget. If we know in advance that your findings will have to be shared openly, let's plan for that at the beginning of the grant application and budget for it so that your grant funder pays that fee. We can help you to access different APC publication options. To assess different APC publication options, helping us to weigh when it may or may not be worth paying. We can help you search for diamond or platinum OA journals, places where we may be able to publish openly with no fee being charged. We can help you to navigate those green OA policies and openly archive traditionally published papers according to a publisher's permissions. And really, ultimately, we can answer any other questions that you may have in this area as it pertains to open access or traditional publishing. As a final note, I want to articulate that this is not a value judgment on you either way. I love this quote from Eamon Toole, writing for the Librarian Parlor website. Different expectations, personal goals, readerships, and incentives shape where one will publish. Whether the journal you published in is owned by an evil corporation, an open access labor of love held together by one or two editors, or somewhere in between, the decision can only be made according to your circumstances. Someone is not compelled to publish in a paywall journal because they're a bad person. They publish in a paywall journal as part of a long-established system of incentives and rewards for doing so. So while I think open access is a great option, and I am here to support those of you who would like to pursue it, please know that I make no value judgment on the choice to publish traditionally as well. That concludes our session. I'd like to thank you so much for being here with me or watching this recording. I've got my contact information here. I do consider myself to be a resource to our campus for any researcher, whether you are undergraduate, graduate, faculty, staff. Please feel free to reach out to me for support with the publishing journey. Have a wonderful day.